Sheri Weppel. Sheri is the Director of Training and E-Learning Development at GP Strategies and has over 15 years' experience designing, developing, and delivering interactive computer-based and web-based learning modules. Her role is to drive innovative ISD techniques into the processes and provide valuable input on the state of learning and best-in-class practices. Sheri recently completed her MS in Learning Sciences and Technology with a focus in gaming for instruction at Lehigh University. She's also earned an MS in Instructional Design and Development from Lehigh University and a BS in Art Education from Kutztown University. Sheri, I would like to turn the session over to you. I'm giving you presenter rights now.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Kayla, and thanks everybody for joining us today. The Agile methodology is something I think I might hear 5 to 6 times a day when I'm not having a conversation about Agile, and it's a tricky spot. From a rapid, being a productive and being lean perspective, Agile definitely feels like it's the way to go. And a lot of companies want to move towards Agile, and they'll ask me, how do I move to Agile? And I'll kind of frame the question back to them and go, are you ready to move to Agile? What we're going to start with is we're going to actually compare the different methodologies from a waterfall, your typical ADDIE model, to an Agile approach, because I think that's going to help us start to discover how we can best use Agile development methods in an outsourced sort of relationship. So one of the things that we noticed as we started to look into the Agile approach is really the only thing that's different is that we're cycling through the phases at the same time. So at the top of the slide, you can see how it says the waterfall ADDIE process, and it has discover, plan, build, and review. If you really think about it, that's really your analysis, design, development, and implement and evaluate. Now, of course, you do go about things in a very different way, that you do a lot of rapid prototyping, that you start building things instead of doing a lot of that upfront analysis, that you just kind of dive in and start tackling the project that you're working on. As we look at the Agile approach, you see all of that discover, plan, build, and review, but it's in different sprints. So we're going to go through and build something and review it, and then we're going to go through and build it again or make the changes that we need to make. The trouble that we have with an Agile approach, though, from an outsourced relationship is it's a little bit of a dynamic involved when you have contracts and you have MSAs and you have service level agreements and you have expectations and you have stakeholders who maybe aren't quite in tune with what the development process is, and they may have problems if they see a product that doesn't look as polished. They may have problems if it's not used to what they're used to from a review cycle standpoint. So what we've developed is a modified Agile approach. You can see that it really doesn't change a whole lot. We've done 2 main things. The first thing is that we added a social contracting piece up front. And then the second thing is that you can see there's a start, and then at the bottom of the screen there's an alpha checkpoint, a beta checkpoint, and a finish. So you can get the benefits of the Agile methodology of allowing you to rapidly prototype, rapidly develop, and then basically bug test and see what you like, see what you don't like, and continue to evolve from there. But we put some safeguards in there to make sure that from a budgetary standpoint you're able to stay in alignment, from a time standpoint you're able to stay in alignment, and also from a partnership standpoint you're able to stay in alignment. And that's what we're going to discuss today. So we're going to dive into a little more detail around the social contracting piece. So from a social contracting piece, what we mean is this: there's certain levels of expectations that everybody has when they work together. If you have a good partnership with your organization, then you've had those kinds of discussions, or you're open to those kinds of discussions. I have one client in particular who we thrive on these kinds of conversations. Whenever there's a question, we make sure that we take the time to walk through what we're looking to do and kind of agree, okay, this is what you're going to do, this is what I'm going to do, this is what our expectations are, to make sure that there's no miscommunication. I find oftentimes miscommunication can be the breeding ground for some ill feelings, or for things to not work out, or frustrations or whatnot. So communication is really key. What a social contracting is it's talking about the challenges that you might face and how you want to handle them, and making sure that everybody's on board. So a couple of them would be, like, for example, the finalization of the deliverables. So if we're talking about the waterfall approach, or the typical ADDIE model, the reviewers have an expectation that everything kind of has a polished look and feel by the time they're done. So when they get a module for review, whether it be a storyboard, whether it be an alpha version, a beta version, they have a level of expectation that it's going to be fully functional, it's going to work, there's not going to be typos, everything's going to be almost as if it's complete. In the Agile approach, the reviewer may be reviewing things in midstream. So for example, you might develop a module and it's still very much in the production phase, but the reviewer has the ability to go in and take a peek and see how things are going. They need to understand that they may encounter bugs or they may encounter issues that may be listed as something that somebody needs to resolve yet. And they need to have an understanding that that's going to occur and that that's okay and that that's a part of the process. So the question that you then have to ask yourself and your business partners are we okay with that? And if you can't be okay with the challenges that you might face from a review cycle perspective of things not being as neat and tidy as they once were, then you might not be quite ready for the Agile process. We also have to think about the amount of changes. So when we have the waterfall approach, we're very prescriptive to what types of changes you expect at the different phases. So we expect these types of changes at storyboard, these types of changes at alpha. With the ADDIE module, Agile module, the Agile approach, you may see more changes later down in the pike. So you may see bigger changes at alpha, bigger changes at beta as you're starting to fine-tune what you're looking to create. So that may just be something that changes. That's just a difference that people will need to be accustomed to. They may have a larger timeline if some edit is injected into the process later on in the game. So that's, again, something that everybody kind of needs to come to terms with of, do we want to put constraints in place so that we know what kind of edits are possible and when? Or are we okay with the fact that we may come up with an idea that's going to be really great in the long run, but might take us a couple of extra days to be able to implement? From a review cycle standpoint, one of the other challenges is when the reviewer has time. So as we look at a lot of the organizations that we work with, obviously you don't have reviewers who this is their full-time job. Everybody has 150% that they're able to get done in a given day, and I say that in jest because I know everybody is booked and overbooked. So to have someone have the flexibility of a review could present a challenge as well. One of the nice parts about the waterfall approach is that you can at least schedule those reviews so that your business reviewers and your stakeholders know when they're going to have to review something. With the Agile approach, they're going to have an increased access to review the content, and whether they're going to have the ability to or the flexibility or the time to is really going to be the challenge. So we need to make sure that we're flexible enough in the approach to make sure that they have enough touch points and that they're going to have the ability to work in this iterative process. And as I go through these things, when I say that there's a go, no-go, it's actually not a go, no-go. Again, it's a part of the social contracting that you would need to agree to. So for example, if you were talking about review cycles and you decide, wow, you know what, I don't have the time to commit to being able to do that, it's a simple matter of social contracting saying, okay, I will commit to reviewing the materials twice a week. I will review on these days and these days to see it in its iterative state, just so that there's a level of expectation and a level of communication about how we're going to work together. When we talk about SCRUM meetings, the reviewer will receive a project status report and have weekly meetings on status is how we've typically worked together in the past. So that's your standard project management approach that I think has existed long before any of us. Now what we have is the project team is going to have twice-a-week calls to collaborate on a solution. There may be quick things that need to get reviewed by the reviewer in return to keep things moving. And that may be a challenge too. If the reviewer happens to have something where they could be in another country, they could be in all-day meetings and they don't have time, we would need to put things in place to be able to have a secondary reviewer or somebody who can delegate that decision to. So that's another thing to consider is the frequency of meetings. It becomes a burden upon the organization to be able to support the frequency of meetings and the frequencies of reviews. So again, it's more of a communication about to what degree do you want to have that level of engagement. Does it become a once a week? Does it become something that you leverage technology to be able to achieve? So for example, do you set up a SharePoint site or some other portal where you post these kinds of questions, and that way when that person who's reviewing it gets an opportunity at night or in the airport, they can jot off a quick email response and they don't have to attend a physical meeting. That can be especially useful when you're working on a global standpoint as well. I love the SharePoint alerts because they come right, or even Yammer alerts, because they come right to your phone and you can just reply back to it and it gets tacked onto the stream where everything else is. So as we start to look at some of these potential challenges, start to think about some technology that may provide a solution as well. From a development tool, it's one of the other challenges, but I'm even considering it less of a challenge than we've seen in the past. So rapid development tools and high-end development tools lend themselves very well to a waterfall approach. With the waterfall approach, there's so many safeguards in place that we know exactly what we can expect. So we know when we need to decide certain things to be able to move forward. With an Agile approach, you're better off using more rapid development tools. So using some of your, like an articulate storyline is a great rapid development tool to be able to develop e-content. You can still use the high-end development tools, but you're missing out on a lot of the benefits of the Agile methodology. Some things that we need to consider is the cost implication of making changes when we're using a development tool that maybe isn't as rapid and easy to edit as others. So again, that's part of the collaboration and part of the partnership discussion is what are the best tools that we can use and what are the consequences and pros of every tool that we might use. And then we also need to consider about the product backlog. So with a product backlog, what we're going to do is we're used to, I deliver a bunch of feedback. By the time I see it next, all that feedback is resolved. With a product backlog, we're prioritizing what feedback gets done and when. So because we have all those iterative phases or iterative reviews, we may run into, I complete my next review and my feedback hasn't been incorporated yet. So again, it's really a change management thing at this point where we're just talking to who the business stakeholders are and talking them through what the approach is. Again, it comes down to communication. It comes down to that social contracting. So these are just a highlight of some of the things that you may encounter as you go through the social contracting piece. And I'd encourage you to have a conversation up front about how you're going to work together and make sure that everybody's on board. And this is not only your vendor partner, this is not only your learning team, but this is also any executive sponsors that you might have. This is also anybody who's going to come in contact with the project. Which leads me to my next point, and that's checkpoints. So much like we have the alpha, beta, final, there's a benefit to having that even if you're using the Agile methodology. So a couple of checkpoints to consider are stage gates. So while we're not going to be as prescriptive about the deliverable changing from storyboard to alpha to beta to final, having those checkpoints before we do things like purchasing stock photos, purchasing stock video, recording professional narration where there's additional costs. We may want to have certain checkpoints that certain people review it. You know, that we have the stakeholder reviews conducted at an appropriate time so that we don't waste funds that that isn't people time, and they're just costs that we don't want to have to repeat or time that we don't want to have to repeat. We also need to consider the stakeholder reviews. So that you may have within your social contracting, you may determine that there are certain people who really need to see a finished product. In that case, we may want to hold off on them reviewing it until after the beta checkpoint, because then we know that the bulk of people have reviewed it, they're really good with it, we can move it to review with the senior stakeholder at that point in time. So it's a lot of perception as well, so you want to make sure that everybody puts their best foot forward, especially in some of those high-level reviews. So that's just something to consider as well. The other thing to consider is that projects still do have deadlines and go-live dates. So we want to make sure that we do have something in place where we have some targeted dates that we're looking to hit. The Agile approach works really great for internal development where you have a whole team that's together and you're collaborating, but all of us need marching orders to be able to meet the needs of what we need to do and what we need to complete and when. So those checkpoints are just really good to allow us to keep ourselves in line and keep ourselves moving on a path forward. So some key takeaways, again, as we look at this model again, the waterfall approach is something that we're all familiar with, and honestly, we're going to be able to come up with a lot of different design methodologies, but they're never really going to change that much. You know, from a standpoint of, as you look at this, we're always going to need to discover what we're going to do. We're going to need to set forth a plan of how we're going to do it. We're going to build something, some sort of training solution, and then we're going to review it to make sure we got it right. Now, whether you want to call that analysis, design, development, implementation, and evaluation, or you want to call it discover, plan, build, or review, fundamentally it's the same. The real difference that we're looking at this point is, do we want to do that in individual stages where we have a sense of completion after each one, or do we want to allow ourselves the flexibility to have a more iterative process to be able to continue to hone in and improve upon the previous phase. So there's a lot of benefits to that, but again, I'd encourage us to do some social contracting, making sure that everybody is in agreement with how we're going to proceed and how we're going to work together. Honestly, social contracting isn't just an Agile methodology type of a philosophy, it's just good business sense to open those lines of communication, because you can make wonderful magic happen if you're able to do so. And then having those checkpoints in place just to keep us all in line. It's just that kind of safety net that makes sure that everything is moving smoothly. There is one final thing that I think is really, truly important, and that is partnership. So if you want to move to this Agile methodology and you want to get a lot of its benefit, it is very critical that you have a sense of partnership with whoever you're working with. That's everybody from your senior stakeholders to your vendor to your internal learning team to whomever. Everybody has to feel like a part of the team. So everybody's going to have a place, everybody's going to know the rules, everybody's going to know what's expected of them, and that's when you're going to be able to truly collaborate and get a lot of really great benefits out of your time together. So with that, I'm going to open up the Q&A. So one of the questions that we got was whether the slides will be available after the webinar, and that is absolutely true. So if you have any questions, you can enter the questions in the Q&A module, which is on the right-hand panel of your WebEx. And I'm going to start to answer some of those questions now. So one of the questions that we have is, what is the biggest challenge that you see out of all the ideas that were presented today? So the biggest challenge, honestly, does come down to those reviews. You know, we do have a certain level of expectation that a reviewer has about completion, about whether feedback was incorporated, whether something looks polished, whether something looks done. And with an Agile methodology, you do have the added challenge of the fact that it's not always done, it's not always right, because you're working on it together in process. So a lot of it just takes patience to be able to kind of work through that and to have a level of understanding. So the first project, there would definitely be a learning curve. I'd recommend having some weekly meetings in the beginning, just very open-ended, very candid, to kind of talk through things, and making sure that there is that partnership there. One of the other questions that we have is, do you find Agile methodology works better with e-learning than with instructor-led? Actually, no. I may even flip the coin on that and say that it may work better with instructor-led, just because the instructor-led training materials are typically more malleable. So you have an easier time editing those materials than you do sometimes with e-learning. It really works well for both. The biggest benefit to e-learning and the Agile methodology is when you use a rapid development tool. So instead of doing a storyboard like you may, and every organization has probably 3 or 4 different types of templates that they've used for storyboards in the past, instead of using a templated approach, what you would do is you would go directly into the development tool and start storyboarding. So you get a lot of that benefit of you immediately have that finished product. You know, it may not have all the polish and shine and whatnot that you want on it, but you are taking a step in that right direction. And that's where you're going to find your biggest benefit, is that you can start to build it, people can start to see it, they can start to play with it. You're going to notice things like inconsistent navigation, you're going to notice things that don't make sense, you're going to notice things like interactions that don't work. far sooner in the process than you would using the standard methods. Another question that we had was, I had an instance where I had to combine both Agile and waterfall approaches. Project started with the waterfall approach and then shifted to Agile as the project required rapid prototyping at the development stage. Do you recommend this approach? Absolutely. You know, and that can be a part of your social contracting as well. It's possible within your social contracting you may agree to, with this particular project, the project is ill-defined, we don't know what the solution is going to look like. Let's spend a little bit more time working together on that plan and that design before we get started in actually doing the development. So that is definitely a possibility. It is always nice to kind of talk through, you know, it doesn't have to be 6 months of analysis, but to talk through what you're looking to do and where you're looking to go rather than just diving in. So for example, yesterday I was working on the design of a SharePoint site. I wanted to jump into the SharePoint site and start playing around, but I actually mocked it up in PowerPoint first just because it helped me work through the process before I actually started creating components like document libraries and whatnot. So while I can still move things around, you know, I was able to work through a lot of the kinks that would be harder to change later on. So, you know, especially if part of what you're talking about is what development tool you might want to use, it's a good idea to know what you're looking to build before you select that development tool. The next question is, does Agile process apply to e-learning development? It actually applies to a lot of different types of development. So the Agile methodology is really the whole point of it is that you're not going to spend a lot of time up front doing analysis, that you're just going to start building. So you're going to start diving into what that solution looks like and work through it together. So it really comes from actually software production, and that's where a lot of it stems from, is the build of a software. But you can have that with instructor-led training. You can have that with e-learning development. You know, really anything where you're looking to create a product or some sort of output is where you'd be able to use this methodology. Another question is, in order to successfully utilize the Agile methodology, what emerging skills are required? I would say communication skills are number one. You know, being able to clearly articulate what you're looking for, what your feedback is, you know, what you need and how you're feeling about the experience is going to be key. From a technology standpoint, there isn't a whole lot different that you need to be able to do, but a lot of it is that social negotiation. A lot of that is that communication. A lot of that is being a strong person in the standpoint of you can kind of take the criticism, you can have the difficult conversations and be able to manage the relationship, and that really takes both sides to be able to do that. You know, there's going to be times in which you're going to be not necessarily disagreeing, but you're going to be having a healthy dialogue about which direction something should go. You can't have a lot of ownership necessarily over what the solution is because you're all a part of that solution. So that's kind of a different mindset for a lot of people, to be able to be one group who's making a decision on one specific thing. So that's probably the, you know, the communication and the social styles that you need to be able to be successful is probably what I would consider the most critical path. What types of companies are moving to Agile methodologies? What is the adoption rate of Agile methodologies? The adoption rate I'll have to get back to you on, and we'll have a blog post followed up in the next day or so. But really a lot of companies, from software implementation to training development to, you know, anything where there's a product that's being produced, are starting to move to some of these types of models. From an adoption rate, it's tricky, and I can give you at least my perspective. We hear a lot of talk about wanting to move to Agile. Not a lot of people are actually going there. I think it's pretty scary for some of them, giving up that control and changing the way that we once worked. I think that we need to understand that the tools that we're using now are so much more advanced than they were in the past, that we're missing out on some of the advantages that we have. So for example, in the past, you know, to do rapid development in a tool like Flash would have been very challenging. You know, your instructional designer is not going to be necessarily the person who's developing in Flash, so there may be, you know, skill set issues with rapid prototyping. But now your instructional designer could work directly in a storyline or a presenter or a Captivate or whatnot, you know, and they have that flexibility. If we go with the standard route, we may not be taking advantage of that, and we may not be able to reap its benefits. So one other question we have is, how do you manage hitting your learning objectives of the course when you may not receive finalized content until further along in the sprint? So that's a really good question. You know, one of the things that you have to consider as you're going through these sprints are, you know, whether you're getting your goals accomplished. So that's another reason why we encourage those checkpoints at the different phases, so that periodically you're looking back at the content, making sure that you're getting what you want out of it, and identifying in the issue log anything that you might be missing. So we are almost out of time for questions. I will promise to answer all the questions in the Q&A blog post that we're going to follow up, but at this point in time, I'll turn it back to Kayla.
Great. Thanks, Sheri. Those are wonderful questions and a great presentation. As everyone may have noticed, Sheri covered a lot in only 20 minutes, and there's still a lot more to discuss. There's still a few questions we haven't answered. And so we do encourage you to continue the conversation with Sheri. Her contact information is on this slide. And as she mentioned, we'll be sending everybody a link to the follow-up blog post where she'll address some of today's questions as well as key takeaways. I'd also like to remind everyone that the recording and slides from today will be sent to the email address that you provided within the next day or so. So we'll go ahead and wrap things up. Thanks again to today's speaker, Sheri Weppel, and thanks to everyone who attended for your time and attention. We hope that you join us for our next GP Strategies webinar on training alternatives to the Workday Adoption Toolkit. This will be on April 22nd. For GP Strategies, I'm Kayla Rotz. I wish everyone a great day.